I teach English as a second language. Well, at least I think I do. To be perfectly honest, it's hard to know what I teach, or at least what to call what I teach. There are so many confusing, seemingly overlapping abbreviations that can be applied to teaching English as a second language. Clearing up this confusion, then, is the topic of today's solo podcast. I'm Teacher David, and this is TESL for Newbies. Although today is episode 2, it's actually step 1 of 24. If you want to know what the 24 steps are, I've added a link in the description below. So today we're going to mostly focus on the abbreviations most commonly used when referring to the subject of teaching English to non-native English speakers. Metaphorically, I think it helps to think of English as a tree, the teaching of English as a tree, and from the tree, from the main trunk, come branches. The branches, each branch can represent an abbreviation or an area of teaching English as a second language, conceptual or philosophical area. For me, I've divided it into three main branches of abbreviations. The first branch contains ESL and ESOL/EAL. So it's kind of two sub-branches with that one. The second main branch is simply EFL. It's a branch on its own. The third main branch is also subdivided into ELA and ELT. So I'll explain what these abbreviations are in a bit. We'll go over them each in detail. So right now I won't do that. What I do want you to know is that this is not an exhaustive list. There are many, many abbreviations that people use when referring to teaching English as a second language to non-native speakers. The first branch then is divided into ESL on the one side and ESOL or EAL on the other side. The one we'll talk about first is ESL. ESL means English as a second language. It's probably the original abbreviation used for teaching non-native speakers of English. And it's the one that's most likely that you'll come into contact with. It's the one that's most commonly used at home and abroad, actually. So ESL is used around the globe regardless of what is being taught and where it's being taught. But we'll get more into that in a minute. So ESL, strictly speaking, is taught in countries where English is an official language. It's a mother tongue of the people of that country. So what it is the ESL students move to that country, the non-native speakers, they move to an English-speaking country, such as Canada or the United States or Australia, and they become students and they start learning English in that country. Many of those people are adults. They're there usually for work or something, some other reason like that. There's a key point, though, with ESL that we're going to come back to, and that is when you study ESL, you go to a school, for example, to study. When you leave that school as the student, when you go outside and start walking around, you still hear English. You still use English. This is a huge benefit. This is something that can't be ignored. People talk about this as being immersed in the language. That's exactly what ESL is. You're being immersed into English. This is also why then people sometimes have argued, or I've heard argued, that in an ESL classroom, it's perfectly okay to bring in the students L1 into that L2 classroom, their first language into the second language. Because they're going to hear the language they're studying everywhere anyway. It's all over the place. So that's definitely a huge distinction that we're going to have to remember. However, over time, some academics, in their infinite wisdom, have decided that the concept of ESL, English as a second language, was too narrow. They thought that, well, many people speak more than two languages. This is a funny argument to me. I mean, after all, as language speakers, we should know the difference between English as a second language and English as the second language. A second language doesn't mean there's only one more language. It's the indefinite determiner. It's not a definite determiner. It means one out of a possibility of many. I'm going to come back to this, what I feel irritation. So the second sub-branch is ESOL or EAL. ESOL means English for Speakers of Other Languages. To be honest, I find this abbreviation a little bit clunky. I speak English and Mandarin Chinese. So does ESOL apply to me when I study English? Because I'm in English with other languages. So anyway, I find that a bit confusing. So for me, I prefer EAL, which it doesn't have quite the same amount of clunkiness. EAL means English as an additional language. Okay, that's great. It's just an additional language. It obviously means that you have a language, and this is going to be added on top of that language. So it's a supplemental language, an extra language, if you will. So regardless of your choice, both of these things are meant to focus on newcomers who speak multiple languages, newcomers to the native English-speaking countries. So as such, these two abbreviations are kind of meant to replace ESL and EFL. We'll talk about that in a minute. So that way it applies to all non-native speakers of English, kind of equally, regardless of the setting. However, this didn't exactly happen. More distinction kind of crept in. So ESOL is largely applied now to adults, to workers in English-speaking environments. So the goal is not just the language, but it's also for them to function well in a new society with a new language and new cultural norms and challenges. So all of that is kind of wrapped in the language learning. EAL, however, kind of on the other hand, has primarily come to be used for children in school settings. So again, like ESOL, the goal is to function well in a new environment, but in this case, it's a learning environment, not a working environment. So they're trying to deal with children and the educational challenges that they'll have that come with not learning in your first language. So as such, or by extension, you can think EAL has also come to apply to students learning in international schools because they're sort of set up like a native speaking environment. So people in those schools also have EAL. But to my mind, they still both basically just mean ESL. So the second branch I'm going to talk about is EFL, the field in which I'm most experienced, that I have the most experience in. So after ESL, EFL is probably the most recognized abbreviation and somewhat ironically, probably the least used abbreviation. So ESL means English as a foreign language. So EFL then is taught in all non-English speaking countries. So English is introduced in a foreign country as a language to supplement the local first language or local first languages. So EFL then equally applies to children and adults. It's just, simply put, it's a foreign language. It's something that's been brought into a country. There's a key point here. Now, this is in direct contrast to ESL. For EFL, when students leave the classroom, they do not hear English or unless some special situation. But what they're going to hear is the local language or languages. So that, I think, is a good argument against using the L1, the first language, in the classroom. Because if you're learning English for 4 hours a week, say, and yet half of that 4 hours you're using your original first language, then that takes away your opportunity to use English. So, but hey, some people agree with that, some people don't. I'll leave it up to you. I just want you to know that's an argument that people give. Also, unlike ESL, EFL is not usually taught in public schools primarily. Rather, it's taught in cram schools, or what are called cram schools. These are private institutions that focus on teaching English. Now, there are schools, usually private public schools, that also teach English, or universities, but we'll get onto that bit more next week when we talk about jobs. That'll be coming up next week in that podcast. So for now, let's just keep to where we are, and I want to focus on who's teaching right now. So in an EFL situation, there are local teachers who are teaching English and foreign teachers who are teaching English. Usually the idea behind it is these schools bring in foreign teachers because they want the conversational aspect of English. They want somebody with the standard American accent. So think of a hypothetical situation. Imagine you are a native English speaker and you want to learn Japanese. Do you want to learn Japanese from a native Japanese speaker, or do you want to learn Japanese from a native English speaker who's learned Japanese and now is willing to teach you Japanese? What about if you have that same situation, what if that native English speaker or the native Japanese speaker, what if they're teaching you English conversation or Japanese conversation, grammar, academic preparation? Sometimes the local teachers are much better at the nuts and bolts of the language than the foreign teachers are. However, this is a pretty controversial topic, and I'm not giving my opinion one way or the other. I just want you to know that's a possibility. That's something you're going to have to deal with when you teach English as a second language overseas. There are going to be local teachers you're going to work with, and unless you've studied a lot, there's a good chance, in other than conversation and culture, they're probably going to know a lot more about the language than you. At least that's been my experience with local teachers versus foreign teachers. Anyway, for now, I'm just happy to have a job, so let's just keep it at that. So the third and final branch that we're going to discuss today is also divided into two sub-branches, ELT and ELA. So the first sub-branch we'll discuss is ELT, which means English Language Teaching. Now this is quite a catch-all phrase that is meant to encompass all areas of teaching English to non-native speakers. But its focus actually has come to be on conversation. If you're an EL teacher, English Language Teaching teacher, it means that you're focusing on your students in obtaining effective communication, clear and precise communication, kind of like what I just didn't use a minute ago. But anyway, you get the idea. So to go along with that, where you live and who you teach, they shouldn't be relevant to ELT. But are they? I think this abbreviation is a little bit weak also. So consider the following. Is an ESL teacher the best person for the job of teaching ESL? Or is an EFL teacher the best person for teaching ESL? On the one hand, when teaching EFL, it's the teacher, as a kind of newbie to the new environment, who needs to learn about local cultures, traditions, taboos, not the students. They're already familiar. They just need to focus on the language. On the other hand, when teaching ESL, it's the students who need to learn, in addition to the language, local cultures and traditions, not the teachers. So, if a local teacher is teaching EFL, are the students able to authentically learn from a person who maybe has never traveled to a country where English is spoken as the first language? Does that even matter when you teach grammar? I certainly know it matters when you're teaching EFL. A small little anecdote, when I was first in Taiwan, I was invited to a wedding, a coworker's wedding. I went to the wedding and I brought with me, I heard that in Taiwan, people don't usually give gifts, like actual things. What they do is give an envelope with money. And they told me how much money I should give and to bring it in an envelope and kind of hand it to the bride and groom. So I did that. But being Canadian, I went out and found a card and put it in a white envelope, not knowing local customs. So I went to the wedding, gave them the envelope, and the bride looked at me with horror. So it turns out that giving a white envelope, that's the color of the envelopes you give when someone has died. So what I did is I went to a wedding. I should have used a red envelope, as is the local norm. I used a white envelope. I looked a bit of a fool. So that's a small thing, but it matters because when you're teaching EFL, you as the teacher need to learn about those things. Students, when they learn ESL, they need to be learning about those things. So that way, hopefully, they don't look as foolish as I looked. Okay. So anyway, as you can guess, this idea is kind of problematic. Some people might still argue for a different abbreviation and still think that ESL, EFL, those two abbreviations are too narrow, but let's just put them to a side for now. And we'll deal with the second sub-branch. That is ELA. This one is much easier, much less of a minefield. ELA simply means English Language Arts. So like ELT, ELA can apply to native and non-native speakers. But this one, not possibly, but absolutely. Students in Canada learn language arts at school. So ELA is taught as a subject then in bilingual and international schools in foreign countries. For example, here in Taiwan, we use an ELA textbook. But many schools that I've worked at use ELA textbooks. There are millions of them out there. And the idea is you're trying to teach non-native English speakers the way you would teach native English speakers. So instead of directly teaching grammar or conversational patterns or sentences, you're just reading stories. You're answering questions about those stories. You're developing critical thinking. You're doing a lot of things that you would do in any class, in any situation. And personally, I've had many great experiences using these books in classroom settings. I think they can be fun. I think they help learning a lot. Does that mean that grammar still shouldn't be taught? I'm a bit old-fashioned. I think grammar still needs to be taught. I think to native and non-native speakers alike. But for English language arts, it's mostly, the focus mostly or primarily is literacy as opposed to conversation. So that's the distinction that we can meet there. So in an English language arts class, teach like you're teaching native speakers, but switch to ESL tactics when needed, when things come up that native speakers might not have a problem with, but ESL students or EFL students might have concerns with. So that's up to the teacher to kind of traverse through those different areas to make sure the students get the best out of what they're learning. So as you can see, many of the abbreviations used for teaching English as a second language or as a foreign language should tell you a lot about who's being taught, where the teaching is being done, and how the teaching is occurring. However, I got to tell you, this is seldom the case. Most places that I've been around Canada, in South Korea, in Taiwan, different places in Taiwan, different cities, people still always use ESL. It seems to be ubiquitous. It doesn't matter what you're teaching. Nobody outside of academia really seems to care. ESL is fine. If you don't believe me, a simple trick you can do, or a simple check you can do, go to Google, type in ESL jobs overseas. A mountain of jobs will come up. Not EFL jobs overseas, ESL jobs overseas. So it's kind of funny. So my last little piece of advice, or my suggestion, is just go with it. Don't worry about it too much. It's good for you to know the difference between these abbreviations and the theory behind, or the ideas behind each abbreviation, because now you can choose to ignore them as opposed to not knowing what they mean and having to ignore them because of ignorance or because of laziness. Know what they mean, understand how they should be applied, and then just roll with it. Just use ESL. It's fine, really, I think anyway. It hasn't hindered me in my over 20 years of teaching at any moment of time. Not at all. Okay, so that said, in next week's video, as I've kind of alluded to during this week, I'm going to talk about jobs. We're going to get into the meat and potatoes of getting you as a new teacher into a new country, or maybe even your home country, but getting you comfortable with or familiar with the different kinds of jobs you should expect to be able to find, especially jobs focusing on new teachers. But I'll also introduce, for those of you who have a bit of experience already, some jobs that you could look forward to down the road with even more experience, or even if you're in a country and you want to have a change of career. Other jobs are still open to you. So that's what we're going to talk about next week. And I'll even mention a little bit about cost of living and salaries, and kind of comparing those, seeing how the cost of living and a seemingly low salary, but with an extremely low cost of living, makes life pretty comfortable. Okay, that's it for today. See you in 2 weeks. Bye for now.